Hello, I'm Una. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to take you in a maybe too thorough walk through all the books I read in August. This is the first time I've ever done this, so I apologize if I don't really have everything together and I don't know what order to say things in and all of that. But that's how it is. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. So I'm going to start with some like basic overall stats. I'm going mostly off of Storygraph and my own personal book spreadsheet. So I read 24 books in the month of August, which was according to what I tracked in Storygraph, which is not always perfect because if I multimedia read a book, if I listen to the audiobook and read the book, sometimes things are a little bit off, but I read about 4,500 pages and listened to 85 hours of audio. In terms of books I read physically or predominantly read physically, 7 were less than 300 pages, 7 were 300 to 500 pages, and 1 was above 500 pages. And similarly with audiobook length, proportion-wise, not numbers-wise, 3 were less than 8 hours, 5 were more than 8 hours, and 1 was more, or between 8 and 16 hours, and 1 was more than 16 hours long. And I read 20 fiction books as compared to 4 nonfiction books, which is very typical for me, that proportion, 17% nonfiction, 83% fiction. My top genre, to no one's surprise, was fantasy. I read 10 books that were fantasy in some dimension. Storygraph counts genres, like one book can have multiple genres. So if something's fantasy romance, it's a fantasy and a romance. If something's a historical romance, it's historical and romance. If something is a sci-fi mystery, it's sci-fi and mystery. That's not that hard to understand. But anyway, the next genre was LGBT. I read 7 books that were tagged LGBT. My roommate just texted me about her cat, very important. I read 7 books that were tagged romance and 7 books that were tagged contemporary. These are all like semi-genre, something else about the book. 6 books that were young adult, 4 books that were mystery, 3 books that were historical, 2 books that were classics, 2 books that were history, 2 books that were graphic novels, 1 middle grade, 1 book about race, 1 children's book, 1 sci-fi book, 1 book about religion, 1 book about politics, 1 play, 1 memoir, 1 literary book, and 1 crime book. So that was my genre spread, and I'll insert the pictures. I'm sure you're seeing them. Yeah, in terms of other stats that I track, I do track that on average I read 260 pages a day. That's averaging across my physical reading and my audio reading. The average page count was 334 pages, and I read 7 books from authors of color, 9 books with LGBT representation. I count this as like main or primary characters are LGBT, fiction or nonfiction, and 19 books from authors that were new to me. And then I also read 15 books out of the 24 from authors that were women, and I don't think I read any, 1 book from a non-binary author, so I like to track that too. In terms of format, I read 10 books physically, I read 5 ebooks, and 9 audiobooks. And one of these audiobooks I also read the physical book, so I track that as either audio or mixed media if I can do that. And in terms of ratings, I had a really good month. So in my spreadsheet, it just goes by full stars, but my Storygraph has obviously quarter stars. So I had 9 5 stars. I had 11 4 stars across the board, which is 2 4.75, 3 4.5, 1 4.25, and 5 4.0. And then I had 4 3 stars and no 2 or 1 stars. There's one that I kind of rated 2 stars, but so the 3s were 2 3.75 and 1 3.0, and then one that was like 3.0/2.75. I was just kind of being petty because I didn't like some aspects of it. Anyway, I'll insert the graph of my pages and minutes per day just in case you're curious. I feel like you can sometimes see week cycles, but sometimes I throw things off. Like I think the 24-hour reading vlog I did a couple weeks ago really threw some of these numbers off. And I also think it's interesting that I will often go for periods of many days where I don't listen to any audiobooks at all, which is when I'm like in between audiobooks and I haven't figured out what I want to listen to next. But I try to read at least a little bit every day with my eyeballs, like first thing in the morning, so that stays pretty consistent. Okay, in terms of other things that I'm tracking, again, the publication breakdown I think is always interesting to look at. I read 1 book from 2024, 5 from 2023, 2 from 2022, 1 from between 2020 and 2021, 8 from between 2015 and 2019, 2 from 2010 to 2014. I just like to split that decade because I feel like I read a lot of books from there. 3 books from the 2000s, 1 book from the 1920s, and 1 book from the 1890s. So that's my spread. You can tell those last 2 were my classics. And yeah, in terms of how I acquired these books, or like how I read them, 4 were from Kindle Unlimited, 2 were from Hoopla, 7 were from Libby, 6 were from my library, and 5 were books that I owned, which I feel like is pretty good. I was not reading a lot of owned books for a while. Okay, so now I'm gonna get into a rundown of what all the books were and some brief thoughts, and I'll hopefully stop looking off to the side of my screen so much. So I guess starting from the bottom, my lowest rated book was Heartless Hunter. I enjoyed this book more or less while I was reading it. I think in my review I described it as like book junk food or like that kind of thing, but I just didn't think it was a very good book, which is why its rating is so low. I especially thought, I mean, I think it's always kind of tricky with enemies to lovers of how to balance the level of enemies versus the level of lovers or redeemable. But in this case, just the love interest / second POV, the man in this hetero relationship, was basically a cop in this fantasy world, and he just, the way that he thought about and justified the policing that he was doing and the authoritarian and kind of surveillance state control, I just felt like was not handled very well. Like, I think it's fine to use that in your fantasy romance, but it seemed to kind of on the surface level try to engage with that, but ultimately came to very strange conclusions. It reminded me of a lot of the analysis in Sean's video on Harry Potter and the house elves, and how a lot of the material about it kind of somewhat tries to engage with it but just doesn't actually do it well. So anyway, if you're curious, you should go watch that. Next was The Silver Birds. This is indie published, it's like self-published. I really wanted to love it because the cover is so pretty and it's sapphic, but this was like, you could just really tell this was like self-published and didn't have a lot of eyes on it. A lot of things just didn't really make sense about the world and the setting. This was like a fantasy, kind of mysterious fantasy romance type of thing. The setting just didn't make a lot of sense to me. It was like trying to be this like pre-industrial small village setting, but then they like went and got lattes and they were speaking as if they were like contemporary teenagers. And anyway, a lot of things just didn't quite add up, and the relationship didn't feel particularly well developed, so as much as I wanted to love it, I did not end up loving it. Next, so that was my 2.75 and my 3.0. Next was Outdrawn. This got a 3.75, so almost 4. This was a rivals to lovers, also sapphic romance between 2 Black main characters. I did really enjoy a lot of this. I think now I need to start like pulling up the reviews. The relationship was just like not my favorite dynamic, like the way that they kind of realized that they liked each other, and then the setting just didn't feel particularly engaged. It was set in Florida, but I didn't realize that until like 2/3 of the way through the book because they just mentioned it as if it had already been introduced, and I was like, what? But yeah, I enjoyed it overall. I just wouldn't say it was like as good as like what I would give a 4 or 4.5. The last 3-star, that's also 3.75, is Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. I thought this was just like a fun historical romancy audiobook to listen to, which I did enjoy. I think the things that prevented it from being higher on the list were the way that this navigated some of the emotional issues between the 2 romantic leads. I just felt like the amount of like miscommunication or lack of emotional intelligence just got a little bit grating after a while. And also the world was like, it was like kind of fun, but also just kind of very strange. I was expecting like historical romance, and then there was like alchemy and like magical objects, and it was just a little bit over the top, which was fine, but it didn't make it like an incredible book, but totally fine. All right, into my 4 stars. A lot of books got 4 stars flat, so the most recent one that I read, it was actually the last book I finished in August, is Dragonoak, The Complete History of Kastelir, which is also a self-published book that I read on Kindle Unlimited. This I did enjoy. I think maybe I read it too slowly, but it felt kind of like there wasn't a lot happening a lot of the time. It was like a journey, but the main character never knew what was going on. And then we like got to this other country and these political things seemed to be happening, but not always very close. And then it ended very spoilers, it ended very dramatically. Like there was a lot of action at the end, which I enjoyed, but I think just like overall it wasn't paced well enough to balance those things. I did really like the relationships between the characters. There was also sapphic and also like polyamorous, which I like. I have not read a lot of books like that, if any, and I definitely want to keep going in the series, but it was just like a solid 4. I didn't feel like so emotionally invested like I would with a 4.5 or a 5, but I'm interested. It had a couple issues, but I'm ready to keep going. Next, 4.0 I read was The Wall, Growing Up Behind the Iron Curtain. This was like a kind of comic or picture book memoir of this artist. And this was very informative, like a lot more informative than I expected it to be. Very interesting. It was fun to hear about how he got into art and his relationship to the Soviet state. And I would definitely recommend if you're into reading picture book memoirs. I tend to read kind of a lot of them. For some reason, a lot of them have ended up on my TBR, and it's always kind of fun, or biographies. But yeah, just solid. I feel like picture books often aren't really long enough to get like, oh, this is so good. But it was great. It was good. Next is The Mystery of the Blue Train. This is a Poirot mystery by Agatha Christie. This is one of those kind of similar to a historical romance. Not always, but I feel like every month I have an Agatha Christie audiobook that is just part of my audiobook rotation that I listen to while working or while biking or whatever. This one was a good mystery. I guess I feel like it's hard for me to rate mysteries. I was entertained. I was surprised. I didn't mind the characters. It wasn't like a favorite, but it was solid. Then the next one is A Torch Against the Night. This is the sequel to An Ember in the Ashes by Sabatir. I feel like I've seen people really enjoy this series. I just saw a video where someone was like, no one else seems to like this series. And I was like, ah. But anyway, I didn't like this as much as the first one. The pacing felt off. The sense of distance felt off, which is weird because this is a book all about traveling. Like every main character is traveling, and this also continued to be very brutal in some ways, which is fine, but it's like a little bit more emotionally draining. But I'm definitely excited by some of the developments in it. I'm gonna keep going in the series once I build up some emotional resiliency and manage to put it on a TBR. And then my last 4.0 was Out on a Limb. This was a contemporary romance. This might be, I don't know if it's the highest I've rated a contemporary romance, but this was a surprisingly compelling contemporary romance. It does involve an unplanned pregnancy, so if you're interested, be aware of that. I think my favorite part of this book were the characters. They really felt vibrant and interconnected, and I don't mind an unplanned pregnancy as a plotline. And I also appreciated the depiction of limb difference, and the the main character has a limb difference and the love interest is an amputee, and they kind of discussed about that aspect of limb difference and disability and all that kind of stuff in the context of a contemporary romance. So I feel like it was pretty great, and it's based on the author's experience, so that was cool. All right, next is 4.25. My 4.25 is Everyone's Thinking It. This was a mystery set in a school in England, and the two main characters were two cousins that were kind of estranged. I really like this. I think it's pitched as Mean Girls meets Dear White People. I have not seen either of those properties, but I feel like that does give a vibe of what it's kind of like. A lot of dealing with the kind of casual racism from the institution and from their peers. The two main characters are both Black of Nigerian heritage. One of them is from Nigeria, the other is not. Dealing with gossip and drama and like power struggles and kind of, your late teens and relationships. I liked that one of the main characters was really into photography, and that was kind of a key element. I thought that was cool. It just had a nice vibe. I was interested. I was intrigued by the mystery elements, and I really liked it. So yeah, I definitely read from that author again. It's not a series, but I would read more from her. Next are my 4.5s. So the first one is Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers. One, I did not realize that this was set in San Francisco, which is my hometown, so I had a lot of fun with that. It really made me want to go home and hang around Chinatown and North Beach. I thought this was a lot of fun. I think, echoing what I've heard people say about it, I really liked the found family. I liked the characters. It was definitely funny, but it didn't like grip me. I had a really good time, but I didn't like absolutely love it. I did start reading this from Erin's 5-star reading blog from Booked and Busy. She like didn't have a 5-star for like a year and a half, and this was her 5-star. It was not a 5-star for me, but I'm so happy it was for her, and I'm glad it made me pick it up because I really did enjoy it, and I love reading books set in San Francisco. My other 4-star was Stargirl, which is going to be in an upcoming reading challenge series of mine, which it's a book that's been on my TBR for so long, and I finally read it, and it's like a middle grade about kind of uniqueness and being yourself, and I did enjoy it. I really did enjoy it. That's why I got a 4.5. I wasn't expecting to enjoy it as much as I did, and even though it's pretty short, it's only like 180 pages, I really did feel very connected to these characters, and it reminded me a lot of struggling with identity and standing out and confidence in middle school and high school. So I did almost cry at the end, so I really liked it. Next are my 4.75s. The first one is A Bride for One Night, which I have. I forgot about this one. This book, A Bride for One Night. This was a gift from my rabbi in college, and it's basically this Talmud scholar who takes these stories from Talmud, which, if you don't know, is part of this Jewish written tradition that started as an oral tradition. She takes these stories, which are like, a lot of it is about Jewish law, but these are stories interspersed that maybe illustrate a Jewish law principle or are used as part of commentary as a justification. She takes these stories, which are often very bare bones, like this is the entirety of the original text of one of them, and then she kind of reinterprets and rewrites them from her own perspective and explores more details, and then she has some commentary and reflections on the story. And a lot of these deal with, I mean, this tradition is very male dominated, almost exclusively men have been like, it's a very old set of texts, and so as a woman and as a modern scholar, she really dives into a lot of the relationships, a lot of the depictions of women, of non-traditional relationships, and just fleshes them out in a way that felt very profound and emotional, and I really connected to a lot of them. It has some of my favorite story, or some of the stories that are the principles for some of my favorite teachings I've ever heard. Anyway, really interesting, and I'm glad. It was nice to like read. I would read like 2 or 3 at a time instead of just reading the whole book all the way through, because even though it's a short book, it has a lot of stories in it, and it was like jumping between a lot of different themes. But yeah, I'm glad I read it. It was a very interesting book. Next is Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. This is another one that's been on my TBR for a while, and I was worried that I would be too old to really appreciate this, but I really loved it. I think I wrote it in my initial review. I want to go back and write more, but like this book made me want to read poetry, which I do not read poetry very often. It's hard for me to connect to, so like, you know, it was good. And I think this was written in a really beautiful style. Whoops. It was written in a really beautiful style. I felt like the character work was just so well done. It was really about characters and not much about plot. Like, not that nothing happened, but I just really enjoyed these characters, and I felt very connected to where they were emotionally and what they were struggling with. And I feel like I've already been able to like connect it to so many other things that come up. Struggles around identity. That's one thing that's been coming up, is like Dante has this kind of complicated relationship with his Mexican-ness and his Mexican heritage, whether or not he considers himself Mexican, which I feel like, you know, can be seen in lots of other places. Great book. I'm really glad I read it. And my final 4.75 is The Importance of Being Earnest. This was my one play that I read. I was kind of blown away by how much I liked this. Like, I was just giggling. It was very funny. I mean, this is, you know, it's over 120 years old, but it's still very readable and very funny. And yeah, I was just like, I had a good little time, and I was laughing so much that I couldn't not give it 4.75 stars. I was like, 5 stars is maybe a little much, but this is a lot of fun. And now we are into my 5 stars. So I'm gonna start with most recent to least recent, is that right? No, I'm gonna go first read to last read. So actually the first book I finished this month was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which obviously I read most of it in a previous month. but I read this for a book club, but I actually owned it. I owned it because my friend's mom told him that this was kind of similar to The Night Circus, which is right there, and I wanted to read The Night Circus, so I was ordering The Night Circus online off of Thrift Books, and I was like, I'll just get this too. It wasn't that expensive. And then it came and it was this big, and I was like, maybe I won't, maybe I'll put that off. So I did. But then the book club near me was reading it, so I was like, okay, now's my chance. I loved this book. It was so much fun. I loved the footnotes, and I really feel like they're like an integral part of the reading experience. Like, if you read this and you're tempted to skip the footnotes, do not skip the footnotes. This is my favorite example of the footnotes in this kind of storytelling. Is the book is called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, right? And you're like, okay, these are the two main characters. The whole first section is about Mr. Norrell. You don't meet Jonathan Strange for a while, but at the very bottom of the first page is a citation with a reference to a book by Jonathan Strange. And that just like builds this sense of like, oh, this guy's gonna be important. Like, he's not in it yet, we haven't heard about him yet, but this guy's gonna be a big character because in this world, he's written a book that is already being referenced on the first page of this supposedly historical tome. So this is about magicians in England. If you don't know, I just kind of jumped into it, but it's written in this like faux academic style, which is a style I adore, and it's written really well. It's about English magic, about class differences, about the British aristocracy, about Northern England versus Southern England, Celtic influences. It is so interesting. There's so many concepts packed in here, and if you're into faux academic things, if you're into historical fantasy, give it a read. If you're not, but you'd like those in a different format, if this book is intimidating, there's also a mini series, so check that out maybe, because this is so good. Okay, I'll move on. Next, I read I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. This was, I mean, I have heard great things about this book, but this book was so good. Like, her writing is incredible. It's like very emotionally impactful, very like, it can be blunt at times, but really communicative. And I mean, this is very sad story of child abuse and pressure, and just like the freaky way that the people that happen to be your parents end up having so much control over your life, and they shape how you view the world, and her struggles around trying to figure out what she wants to do, who she wants to be, and how that's informed by her upbringing. Anyway, I'm really glad that she's in a better place. I hope she has all the success in writing and directing. I definitely would love to read more written by her, or anyway, whatever she wants to do. Also, the audiobook is narrated by her, which is really great. Next, I read How the Word Is Passed. This is basically a look at the legacy of slavery in the US by going to these different historical sites and kind of experiencing them and investigating how they depict the history of slavery, how they depict its connection to the modern day. There's a wide variety of sites, including one not in the US, where a lot of enslaved people were coming from when they came to the US. And anyway, it's really beautifully written. The author, Clint Smith, is a poet, and I feel like you can really see that in his prose. His description of these places, you can really visualize them, but also the way that he weaves together academic and historical research in these fields and about these places is really interesting. The differences between the different narratives that different places promote, or even that different tours of the same place promote. I was talking to my grandparents after this, and they had been to Monticello, which is the first place he goes, and talked about how disappointed they were that the tour that they went on didn't really engage with its connection, its foundation in slavery, and the fact that it was built with the labor of enslaved peoples. And I was like, it would be like, yeah, well, you went on the one tour that, according to the research in this book, hasn't changed since the 50s, and they have specific tours about the lives of the enslaved people there and Thomas Jefferson's connections to slavery and his involvement in slavery. Anyway, really, really interesting book. I would say if you live in the US, read this book. If you don't and you're interested, also read it. But I feel like it's so important to so much of the history of this country and the way that we can interrogate narratives of public history. Like, public history is very different from history you learn as a kid versus history you can learn as an adult versus the history that's told in public spaces. It can be very outdated, and it can also be a center, like a nexus of a lot of like battles, current battles, like when all the fights about removing Confederate monuments. Anyway, there's so much good stuff in here. Next, I read Minor Detail. This is a novella by a Palestinian author that's kind of about this woman who's investigating the sexual assault and murder of a woman in 1949, I believe, like right after the creation of the State of Israel, a Palestinian woman by Israeli soldiers. And this was just like hauntingly beautiful and horrible, and it really captured me. I read this on a day where I was supposed to be sad. It was a day of mourning, and I felt like this was just kind of that perfect reflective and sad and tragic. It was just like, I'm glad I read it at a time. I was in just the right mood to, I think, appreciate it the way that it deserves. So yeah, really good. Okay. Next I read Thistlefoot. This was recommended to me by a friend. He was like, what's that book that's like the grandchildren of Baba Yaga? And someone managed to find that it was Thistlefoot, and I was like, okay, I'll read it. But this is kind of a book about these two siblings who inherit Baba Yaga's house with chicken feet, and they're kind of estranged. Their older brother, younger sister, the older brother kind of ran away. They grew up in a family, a puppetry family. So they have this house, and there's this villain chasing after the house, and they're putting on puppet shows. I think just like the vibes, the imagery, the genre of this was really immaculate. It's kind of this folktale based contemporary fantasy, which I really enjoyed. I liked the puppet ambiance, and I also really liked the Jewish elements. They're a Jewish family, and there's kind of this theme of generational trauma and generational pain, and like where do these things come from, and also kind of the nature of storytelling. There are interspersed chapters from the house's perspective where it's kind of telling you stories about its origin. I really liked it. I think the writing was not quite as strong in the main narrative chapters as it was in the interstitial chapters, but overall it was really solid, and in some parts it was especially beautiful. I'm a younger sister, I have an older brother, then in some ways our relationship felt very similar to the one in the book, so I think that also hit pretty hard for me. So yeah, I really enjoyed Thistlefoot. I didn't think I was gonna go to 5-star, but by the end it was a 5-star for me. Next, I read Gideon the Ninth, which is in a vlog that I did if you want to see more about me reading it. This took me a little bit to get into, but once I was into it, I was into it. This is about I don't even know if I want to say that much, but it's like a science fantasy. Gideon is an indentured servant to the House of the Ninth, which they're different houses on different planets in this solar system, and the heir to the House of the Ninth is called to the first house to go undergo this trial, and she needs a cavalier, and so Gideon is chosen to be her cavalier. And there's just so much it's a lot of necromancy. So the heir is the necromancer, and every necromancer needs a cavalier. That's kind of how it goes. But there's so much, I don't know, jumping into this book, it can feel like a lot, but I was so gripped by this world and this lore, and yes, you have to get to know it slowly. If you want to read this book, know that there are supplementary materials at the end. You might want to read some here and there as you go through it. When I was reading them, I was like both cursing myself for not noticing them earlier, but also being like, when could I have read this where this would have made more sense to me than the opening of the book? But anyway, the world is a lot of fun. I'm really excited to continue in it. I'm trying not to get too excited so that I don't scare myself off of reading the next one. But I thought this was like a 4.5 or 4.75, but then I was just thinking, like when I would try to fall asleep at night, I was just still thinking about this world, so it's a 5-star. The next two were the first 2 volumes of the Adventure Zone graphic novels. So this is Here There Be Gerblins and Murder on the Rockport Limited. This was originally a live play D&D podcast, and now it's just D&D themed graphic novels. You can still listen to the podcast. These made me want to re-listen to the podcast so bad. I said when I reread the first one, this I had already had and this was new. I said it in my in my blog, but the amount of overarching story elements, of running jokes, and also of the like emotional through line and like emotional moments in these, I was so impressed. I had such a good time. I thought they were really funny, which is like why I enjoyed the podcast, but also just like that this story is really intriguing. These characters are always really intriguing, and just like I want to spend more time with them, and I really want I want to keep going in the series, but I don't want to keep buying them, and my library doesn't have them, so we'll see. I want to keep buying them eventually. I just don't want to spend a ton of money right now. But yeah, these are really great. I would highly recommend if you can get your hands on them. My old library used to have them, but then I moved. But I love these characters, I love this story. It goes so many places from here. Each arc is so much fun, so really glad I read this. And finally, Turtles All the Way Down. This is one of the 3 last books I read in the month, I think, by John Green. This, I'm way late to the party. I'm 7 years late to the party. I do also have a signed copy, so that's cool. But yeah, I was a big John Green fan in middle school, and then I kind of fell off for a while, but this really, I felt very emotionally connected to it. I think that some people don't like it because there's not a lot of plot, or the blurb is kind of misleading, or they just didn't connect to it. And I will say the blurb is a little misleading, but I did not mind the lack of plot like at all. I think it was really just about these characters and their emotional relationships, and it wasn't perfect, but I think it really hit me. I was really there. I think John Green is really good at doing that with his writing. The amount of his books that have made me cry, this one made me cry. Like, I was crying the whole last third of the book, and I feel like if a book can connect with me emotionally in that way, for the most part, it's gonna get a 5 stars. And yeah, I mean, I think the central thing is the depiction of OCD. That was really important to him, as I understand it, in writing this book, and in being involved in the movie, which just came out, which I do want to see now that I've read the book. And it also just, I talked to my friend who really loved this book and the movie recently, and so like having that connection to her. And I don't have OCD, but I think like a lot of mental illness or disorders, like it's an exacerbated version of things that other people do deal with, like, you know, intrusive thoughts. Everybody can get intrusive thoughts. It's just an OCD that they become pervasive and can be all-encompassing and kind of control your life in that way. So like I've definitely had struggles with intrusive thoughts. I am excessively sentimental and emotional in a lot of ways, so I think the cat really wants to get into my room. Are you a poor little creature? You can come into my room if you want. This guy's a little demanding, but that's okay because he's very cute. Anyway, 5 stars. Like I said, I just felt very connected. So that's all the books I read this month. Hopefully that was enough statistics and descriptions to satisfy you. And yeah, I'll close out with a clip of my roommate's cat being adorable. And I'll hope to see you soon. Bye. Doing.